Hi, I'm Jeremy, the ZooNerd, coming to you from my backyard in Los Angeles, California. How's everybody doing today? I hope you're well. I hope you're happy. I hope you're healthy. Hope you're taking care of yourself and doing something every day that encourages you to live a good life. Be a little happier and taking care. Today we're going to talk about an amazing species. In today's Critter Chat, we're going to talk about Komodo dragons, the largest of all lizards. Now, Komodo dragons are kind of an animal that was unknown by Western scientists for a very long time. It wasn't until 1912 when they were first described by the scientific community. That's a really long time for an animal that large to go unknown, but they come from a very remote area, and there were a lot of legends and stories that existed about them kind of before they were ever described. And that kind of led to them being called dragons. But for starters, they are the largest of all lizard species. There's about 3,000 kinds of lizards around the planet. And the Komodos by far are the biggest weight-wise. There are two different kinds that can get a little bit longer, but they're much skinnier, lengthy lizards that don't weigh nearly as much. So being a lizard, they are also a reptile. So let's review real quickly what that means. That means that they're going to lay eggs, they're going to have rough, kind of scaly skin, and they're going to be cold-blooded or ectotherms, relying on outside sources to help control their body temperature. So that means on a hot day like it is today in LA, it's 93 here right now. A Komodo dragon, if it was in my backyard, which it isn't, there's not one here, which I'm grateful for. I'd be pretty scared to have one in my backyard. But if it was here with me, it would probably be looking for a place to cool down. So laying in the shade, possibly in some mud, or even a small, shallow body of water, a little stream. They'll do that to keep cool during the heat of the day, for sure. They also, as reptiles, would be laying eggs. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And they have some other very reptile things going on that we'll describe and discuss today as well. For starters, let's talk a little bit about their physical features. So how big are they? The big males get bigger than females with Komodo dragons, can be 9 or 10 feet in length. So they are huge, and they can weigh between 200 and 300 pounds. Now there's a big weight range there, and that's because the same lizard can weigh both of those weights within a very short amount of time. He could be down in the 180 pound range and then eat a big meal, a big meal, and then be near a 300 pound weight. They have the ability to eat up to about 80% of their body weight at one time. So they can really fluctuate in weight a lot over a short amount of time. If it did eat something that big, it would then not eat for quite a while, and then its weight would kind of go back down. They also have very sharp claws, and they have 4 feet. On each foot they have 5 digits, and on each of those a very sharp claw. Those help them in a number of ways, catching their food, and also when they're younger, climbing up trees. We'll talk about that more in a bit too. In general, they are solitary, so they usually live alone. They don't interact a lot with others of their same kind, unless it's for breeding, or possibly if there's something big that's dead, multiple lizards may be eating on it at the same time. Although they are very defensive towards their food, a big Komodo dragon would definitely try to chase off smaller Komodo dragons if they came to try to get his food. A bigger Komodo dragon would sometimes steal food from the smaller ones. And they would all kind of respect and stay away from a dragon much bigger than them, so that they don't become food themselves. In their mouth, they have 60 very sharp, serrated, and backwards curled teeth. So their tooth from the side kind of looks a little bit like this, curving at the top towards the back. With those very sharp teeth, they are able to really cause a lot of damage when they bite. And that can cause a lot of issues that we'll get into in a minute. They also have really good eyesight. They can see in color, which is not always a common thing with reptiles, but they have done some testing with Komodo dragons, and they can definitely see in color and see very well during the day, which is when they're usually the most active, is in the morning. Now, they also have extraordinarily good sense of smell, and their sense of smell is a bit different than ours. They actually have an additional organ in their body that we don't even have. So it's sometimes really hard for us as humans to understand the complexity of that. Our sense of smell is pretty weak. We don't use it as much as other animals do. So we are sometimes lucky if we can smell like the neighbors making bread or something, but beyond that, we don't smell much. A Komodo dragon has a very sophisticated sense of smell. And you may have seen this with several reptiles that share this trait. They flick their tongue in and out of their mouth. And their tongue is forked, so it kind of has two different points at the end. And as they flick it out, they're gathering information. And with that, their tongue can kind of taste things in the air. And then when they bring their tongue back into their mouth, they push it up to the top of their mouth, and there's an organ up there called a Jacobson's organ, and it's common in a lot of reptiles. Not all of them have it, but it helps process the information between their tongue and their brain. And so through that, they're actually smelling kind of the world around them. And with that, a Komodo dragon can smell something like blood from about 6 miles away, which is very impressive. If we could smell things that are 6 miles around us, I can only imagine all the different smells we would smell out in the world. In addition to the Jacobson's organ that kind of helps process that, they also can smell really good just through their nose as well. They are definitely ambush hunters. So especially the big guys are very calculated and very smart in how they catch their food, typically waiting along a little trail or near a water hole where they know their food is going to walk by, and they'll kind of hide in some of the lower bushes and then lunge out and grab their food. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. First, let's start with how they live when they are first hatched, when they come out of their eggs. And we'll talk a little bit about the moms digging the nest and laying the eggs. So when a female Komodo dragon has eggs and she needs to lay the eggs, she's going to look for a spot to lay a nest or dig a nest. There's a kind of bird that lives in the area where they're from that builds big nests out of leaves on the ground. And as the leaves kind of decay, it creates some heat that helps to keep things really warm. And the birds there that build these nests nest kind of in the what we would call the spring months, so like March and April. And the Komodo dragon, she's laying her eggs usually between September and October. And so she will look for some of these old bird nests and build a nest in or around the same area and use some of what the birds gathered previously to help make her nest. She also will dig a hole about 6 feet deep, so that's about as deep as I am tall. And she'll lay her eggs down in this hole. She'll lay between 15 and 30 eggs. They're good size. They're like the size of a grapefruit. And they're not like a chicken egg. They're not going to have a hard shell. They're going to have kind of a leathery shell. So it's going to feel more like a shoe than like a chicken egg. But depending on the conditions, she may lay more eggs or less eggs. If she's had a really good year, she's really healthy, she's had a lot of food. If the temperatures and humidity and all those conditions are right, she'll lay more. If it's been a little tough, if she's struggled to find food, or if she's been sick or injured, it will be less eggs. But she'll dig this hole, she'll lay the eggs, and then she's gonna stick around and guard that nest. She may even make several nest locations, and only one of them will have the eggs in it. But the others will be kind of decoys in case other animals are trying to dig up the nest. She'll set some decoys around to kind of confuse the other animals. So she's gonna stand guard over the nest for a couple of months. She usually lays the eggs in like August or September, and she may hang around until like December, kind of guarding the nest, making sure nothing is trying to get in or steal the eggs. Lots of animals would try to eat Komodo eggs, including other Komodos, and so she would have to kind of protect them for a few months. Now she's gonna take off in like December, because that's when it gets to be the rainy season, and once it starts raining, she either feels there's less of a threat, or she feels that it's a better time for her to go do other things, so she'll kind of leave, and the nest will just sit there, continuing to incubate the eggs. The eggs stay there for about between 7 and 8 months, maybe 9 if conditions are not quite right. It might take a little longer. But that's a really long time for eggs to kind of sit and incubate. That's a very good time. So then these eggs, when they hatch, again, they're like grapefruit size. The babies are about a foot long, and most of that's tail. If you saw the photos I posted on Facebook or Instagram, the second photo is a baby Komodo dragon that's only a couple weeks old. So they're very brightly colored, but they're still pretty big considering they're little babies. And once they're born, they use those claws on their feet to climb up the trees. During their first 2 years of their life, they spend all their time up in the trees. That's for a couple reasons. One is that the more of their food is going to be up there. The baby Komodos eat a lot of insects, small lizards, small birds, birds' eggs, maybe some small mammals. And definitely they also want to be up in the trees to be a little safer. Baby Komodo dragons often get eaten by other things, including big Komodo dragons. So they are definitely cannibalistic, or they'll eat their own kind. I doubt that a mom would eat her babies, but pretty much anybody else might. So they definitely try to kind of stay on their own throughout most of their life. And a smaller dragon is always going to be leery of a bigger dragon who may try to eat it. Let's talk a little bit about the other things that they do eat. So they will eat snakes, they will eat other lizards, including Komodo dragons. They will eat eggs, either from Komodo dragons or birds, or maybe turtles or snake eggs as well. And they will also eat birds, deer, pigs, and big things like buffalo. Now you may be wondering, how does this big lizard eat something as big as a buffalo? And it's gonna hide kind of down in these low bushes. And when the buffalo comes walking along or is getting a drink, the Komodo dragon's gonna kind of jump out of the bushes and bite the buffalo. And it's probably rare that the Komodo dragon initially biting the buffalo is going to kill the buffalo, but it's got a couple secrets going on with it. So inside this mouth, with all these 60 sharp teeth that bend backwards, they also have a lot of saliva, spit. And their spit is full of a lot of different kinds of bacteria, especially since they eat a lot of things that are sometimes rotting and dead, called carrion, or dead food, dead animals. Some of that causes bacteria that grows in their mouth, and that can cause infections and make animals that get bit very, very sick. And for a long time, scientists thought that that's how this process worked, is that the Komodo dragon jumps out, bites the buffalo gets an infection, and then the Komodo dragon, with its really good sense of smell, smells where the buffalo goes, follows it, and a couple days later, if it gets real sick and dies, it eats the buffalo. But kind of in more recent years, they figured out that there's something else going on too. So inside these 60 very sharp backwards facing serrated teeth, underneath all that is another special organ that they have that's a venom gland. So there's different kinds of venomous animals out there, but there's only 3 kinds of lizards that are venomous. So there's 3,000 lizards, only 3 are venomous. So here in the United States we have the Gila monster. Just south of here in Mexico there's a cousin to the Gila monster called the Mexican beaded lizard. And so Gila monsters are about this big, beaded lizards are about this big. And then the third venomous lizard is the Komodo dragon. That's enormous, right? So they have these very sharp teeth, and in each of those teeth they can inject this venom. And so as they bite on their prey, they're gonna bite several times, and each time they're gonna move their mouth a little bit around, and those sharp teeth are gonna kind of really tear up the skin and some of the muscle of the animal that they're biting. And then the teeth have a little hollow bit in them that pump this venom through them and into the animal. Now, the venom of a Komodo dragon is also a very interesting venom because it prevents the blood in the animals they bite from clotting. So if you've ever cut your finger or your hand, after a while it starts to the blood gets a little thicker, and it eventually makes a scab, and it naturally will stop from bleeding. And that's the way our bodies exist to help us to stop bleeding, and it's kind of to help save you. Well, if you get bit by a Komodo dragon, the venom would work in the blood to make sure it doesn't ever thicken up. And so the animal can actually bleed out or lose so much blood that it dies. And that happens sometimes with big things like the buffalo or even deer or pigs that they go after. And occasionally they go after humans too. Yep, Komodo dragons have successfully killed and on a few rare occasions eaten people. And that's pretty scary that a lizard is capable of doing that, but these aren't just ordinary lizards. These are huge, huge animals that are very smart, very calculated, and are armed with some pretty impressive tools like those sharp claws, serrated teeth, and a venom gland. So that can all be kind of dangerous. Let's talk a little bit about where they live. So they live on the other side of the world from here. So if we were to go there, we'd have to get on a plane and fly all across the Pacific Ocean and go, once we got over there, probably go on a couple more flights in the country of Indonesia. Indonesia is a country that's mostly islands, or it's all islands, located kind of between Australia and China. And so it's all those islands that sit kind of in that little pocket between Australia and Asia. And it's thousands of islands. But Komodo dragons only live on 5 of those islands. So those are called the Lesser Sunda Islands. And 4 of them are in a protected area that is now called Komodo National Park. And in 1980, the government of Indonesia declared that that was a national park for those 4 islands and the waterway in between them. So not only does it protect the land, it also protects the ocean that surrounds those islands, which is very beneficial. There's a lot of coral reefs in the water there, a lot of really beautiful fish and marine life live around that space as well. The 5th island, so 4 are in the national park, the 5th one is not. It's a much bigger island, and they just live on part of the island, kind of on the edge, is a bigger island called Flores, and there are 2 million people that live on Flores, along with the Komodo dragons that live there. So in this Indonesian island group, the weather is usually very warm. Even during their winter time, it's still very warm. They typically have kind of a very wet season and a very dry season. During the wet season, it rains a lot. It sometimes floods. It's monsoon rain, so it's rain for days and days and days on end. During the dry season, it sometimes gets very hot, very dry. Forest fires are common. So they kind of have these 2 extremes of wet and dry that dominate their landscape. But it's also tropical forest in parts of it. And the Komodos tend to hang out more in the tropical forest than in the dry side of the islands, although they will kind of go there as needed. Because they're islands and Komodos live on several of the islands, they have noticed that Komodos sometimes swim between the island groups. Now, it's not very common. The Komodo dragons tend to kind of stay in the same place they hatched and live in that area most of their life. But it is possible, and they have definitely documented big dragons swimming between the islands out in the ocean. Let's see, what else do we want to talk about a little bit? Let's talk a little bit about something else that's pretty crazy that Komodo dragons are capable of doing. So when the female lays these eggs, right, and she'll lay a group of them, sometimes the beginning of that is a bit different. So typically with any animal that's going to have babies, it takes a male and a female. And then they come together and they reproduce, and then they can have babies from a variety of sources, whether she carries the babies inside like mammals or lays eggs like birds or reptiles. With Komodo dragons, they don't always need a male. She can have a baby by herself. She can have multiple babies by herself. So when scientists first discovered this, they had a really hard time accepting it and believing it. It's been documented in several species with some fish, some amphibians, and some other little lizards, but never anything as big, as smart, and as complex as something like a Komodo dragon. We're talking an apex predator, the top of the food chain in its environment. So when that happens, what she does is her body just clones its own cells, and the babies inside these eggs that develop are genetically related to her, but not to any other Komodos. And the other interesting thing is that any of the babies that hatch from parthenogenic birth are males. And that's kind of strange, but it's caused some interesting studies to be done. They think it maybe evolved or happened because sometimes a female might be separated from other dragons, and if she technically had babies that were all males, when they got a little older, she could then breed with one of them, and they could start a population on their island. That's kind of a theory. They don't have a lot of documentation of it, but because of parthenogenic birth and those always being males, the only way they can have female babies if there's true breeding, and only about half of those would be females. So there's actually a lot more male Komodo dragons out there than female Komodo dragons, and that's true both in zoos and in the wild. Now, parthenogenesis actually happens in zoos from time to time too. The Denver Zoo just announced today that they have had that happen with their Komodo dragons, and they have 2 new baby Komodo dragons that recently hatched that are both males. They're parthenogenic. They know that there was no breeding with their female Komodo dragon, and so it's kind of an interesting thing that happens from time to time. When my experience with Komodo dragons began when I worked at the Phoenix Zoo. During the time I was there, we were opening a new exhibit called Land of the Dragons, and we were bringing Komodo dragons to the Phoenix Zoo for the very first time. I was involved quite a bit in the grand opening events for that exhibit, and also did a lot of the media interviews when it opened, and spent a lot of time helping guests explore that new exhibit space in the first few weeks that it was open. So that was when I first became very familiar with Komodo dragons and learned about them. And the female dragon we had at the Phoenix Zoo was actually one of the first documented cases of reproducing through parthenogenesis in a zoo setting. So she had 2 sons out there that had hatched from eggs that she laid, having never bred with males. So it was very exciting to learn about that, and one of the things that really continues to fascinate me about this amazing species. Now, I have also since worked with Komodos a little bit in different areas. At the Los Angeles Zoo, as I was training to become a zookeeper, I was cross-trained across multiple departments and areas, and in my time in working with the reptile department, they had recently had some Komodo dragon babies hatch, And the photo I posted earlier today is one of those babies. So that baby is a couple weeks old. And when I was training to be a zookeeper, I worked with the zookeeper who is assigned to take care of those babies for the day. And so he would hold the baby while I would clean out its exhibit space. And even as babies, they each had to have their own space because, as we've talked about, they can be cannibals, they can eat each other, and that's even true when they're babies. So they kept them very much separated from each other to keep them safe. And so when they had a bunch of eggs and they were incubating them, they would make sure that they had a bunch of spaces ready to put the babies in when they hatched so that they could all be safe and taken care of. You'll notice maybe in the photos too that the babies are much more colorful than the adults. Scientists believe that that's to help them kind of blend in more up in trees than the adults, who kind of blend in lower to the ground by the dirt and in some of the lower lying bushes. And the bright colors may help them to blend in with the way that light filters through trees and makes bright spots and light and dark spots, and also leaves changing color, fruits and flowers on trees that would be different colors as well. Now, out there in the Komodo Islands and where Komodo dragons live, it's a very small space geographically. It's only about 700 square miles of land that the Komodo dragons have. That's a very small space for an apex predator that's the top of the food chain. They're actually the biggest animal that's the top of the food chain with the smallest amount of territory anywhere in the world. And because of that, and the location of their space in Indonesia is prone to a lot of natural disasters. The islands are volcanic islands, so there's volcanoes there. Wherever there's volcanoes, there's also potential for earthquakes. Historically, even in recent years, there's been tsunamis in Indonesia. So all of those things can happen. Plus their weather's a little crazy with the monsoon rains and the extreme dry season. Fires and floods can also happen. And because of this potential for lots of natural disasters and the small geographic space, scientists have listed Komodo dragons as vulnerable to extinction because a big natural disaster in that area could cause a huge problem for their population. Now, if you were to go to those islands, the islands themselves, especially the smaller ones, kind of have about as many Komodo dragons on each island as what the island can support and sustain. But they are still listed as vulnerable to extinction, like I said, because the threats from natural disasters are so high. They do also face some problems with people in the area. Like I mentioned earlier, one of the islands, the big island Flores, has 2 million people that live there, and definitely those people sometimes have conflict with the dragons. So that happens from time to time if a dragon comes into a village or near a farm. If it starts eating goats or chickens or cows, the people may get mad. They may try to kill the dragon. They may try to hurt the dragon. And that's understandable. They're just trying to live their life and raise some food. So it gets to be a very tough situation. Out in the national park where the dragons are protected a little more and there's less people there, there's still sometimes a problem with people going to those islands illegally, usually, to either gather the fruit from the trees that grow there naturally or to hunt the deer and the pigs that live there that the dragons need for food. And with the lack of prey species or food sources, dragons sometimes will turn more cannibalistic and eat each other instead, and that can also cause their population to struggle. So those are some of the threats that are out there facing Komodo dragons. Our special shout out today goes to the Komodo Dragon Survival Program. They run the website komododragon.org, and they are an organization that's on the ground in Indonesia, working with local villagers and the rangers at the national park to help make sure that the wild population's safe. They also do a lot of educational stuff for the local citizens and for people who visit the national park. And conservation of Komodo dragons is greatly tied to tourists going and visiting there, although it's an extreme tourist adventure to get there, for sure. And it's a little bit risky. It's on the other side of the world. It's a very remote area. The dragons can be dangerous. And there are stories out there of people getting attacked and people getting killed by Komodo dragons. And it's a little crazy at times. If you want more information about that, you can Google Komodo dragon attacks and read some kind of crazy stories of what has happened. Now, there's also a lot of science that has been done with Komodo dragons, especially recently. In my time at the Los Angeles Zoo, the curator of reptiles had just recently developed a technique to be able to determine the sex or gender of the baby dragon while it was still in the egg. That's important because the population for males versus females in zoos and in the wild is very skewed. There's about 4 males to every 1 female. And so ideally in a zoo setting, if they have 30 eggs that get laid and they're incubating the eggs and they only have maybe 10 spaces for babies to go, they may only incubate 10 of those eggs. Well, it would be within everyone's best interest if those were more girls than boys, because there's already more boys out there. More females would be better for the population's long-term stability. So figuring out what the gender of the baby is inside the egg was very important. And the curator of reptiles at the LA Zoo figured out how to do that successfully. And he shared that science with many other zoos and with the people over in the Komodo Islands. And so in areas where they're having to intervene and save eggs, they can now make sure that they're doing a little more to save the female eggs, as there are less females out there than males. So pretty interesting stuff. I hope you've enjoyed what I've shared with you today. I'll be sharing some more information up on the Facebook and Instagram later today, and uploading this video to YouTube, where you can always catch full episodes of Critter Chat. Always feel free to like, share, follow, and subscribe to any of the content I share across those 3 platforms. And until tomorrow, take care of yourself, have fun, be happy, stay at home, be healthy. We'll see you tomorrow. Take care. Bye.